Good, thanks, John. I'm delighted to be here. As Johnny said, I'm the head of the China unit, and before that I was working in Beijing, and I was there for 8 years, in fact, at the European Commission office there. I'm also delighted to see the old friends here. That's very good. But let me just take you a few years back to when I sort of started to look at China in the early 90s, and when I moved to China in 98, as it was. At that time, just 10 years, 15 years ago, China did not really figure that highly on the European radar screen. When we looked at the trade with China in 1998, we traded actually more with a country such as Norway than we traded with China. If you looked at the political relationship before 1998, we did not have the summits as we have now. We did not really have regular political meetings with the Chinese leadership at the EU level. So also on the security issues, of course, the relationship between China and the EU was at that time very, very far away. In that sense, the EU relationship to China is quite different from the relationship between another power such as the US and China, where you have for decades had a fairly strong interaction because of also the security issues between the two, and the Taiwan issue also, where the US has played a completely different role from that of the EU. What has happened is that there's been this explosion of growth in the Chinese economy since. It started before, but since the base was so low in 1978, when the Chinese economy started to be opening up, even 20 years after in 1998, the overall impact of the Chinese economy at the global scale was not that big. But over the past 10 years, China has now reached beyond a critical mass, as I see it, and it is, without doubt, one of the most important relationships that we have to deal with from the EU side today. We import, in terms of manufactured goods, more from China today than we do from the US. It is our biggest source of imports, and it's continuing to grow. There has been a setback in 2009, but that has nothing to do with China as such. It's the global financial crisis. So that setback has been seen with all our trading partners, basically. But China's share in the EU market, as it looks now, will continue to grow. Also, for European companies working in China or exporting to China, China is today a completely different market than it was just 10 years ago. It means also that we have now to work with China increasingly, as I see it, taken it for given that China is what it is. That is, that China has now reached a size, it has reached a political maturity within the country, it has reached an economic maturity within the country that makes it quite difficult for us to change the direction of the development in China. It is, as you know, 1.4 trillion people. It's a billion. It's a huge country. It's also today, in terms of world GDP, it amounts to something like 7%, we often say. It's the third biggest national economy after the US, Japan. And it means also that they have a much more unified view within the Chinese system on their economic development than we have in Europe or than they have in the US, for example. It is much more structured, not only because of the 5-year plans, but also because in the end you do have some, I would not exaggerate the point, but you do have some central steering of most of the key parts of the economy that we don't see in that way in Europe. So it means that when they start, the Chinese, they start investing in Europe, for example, or in the US, they do it with a slightly different background than our companies they do when they go to China. I understand that many of you are from the private sector, so I'll just say a few words about how China is being seen by European companies working there. In fact, yesterday in Brussels, we had a meeting with the European Chamber of Commerce, which comes to us once a year from Beijing, their headquarters is in Beijing, to explain to us in the Commission what can we do to help them, how can we assist them in their financial operations, their economic activities in China, and how do they see the situation in China on the economic front. And the good news, of course, is that everybody, they see that China is going to pull out of the financial crisis quite well. everybody working there, or the ones who came yesterday at least, expected the growth rate for 2009 to be above 8%, which is, when you compare to the growth rates we see in the rest of the world, is very impressive. In fact, a number of the sectors in China are now, they're now starting to talk almost about the overheating in some sectors. So it's not like the fears on the slowing down of the economy anymore, at least not only on that. What they also said, our European colleagues working in Beijing, was that they saw sort of a slight tendency to an increased nationalism in China. That there's in some sectors a stronger emphasis on ownership. Where does this company come from? Is it a European company? Is it a Chinese company? We saw during 2009 in the spring some discussion about a Buy China campaign, for example, in terms of public procurement. We saw another issue where there was a very large public expenditure on wind turbines, where for some, whatever reason, technical reasons we were given, it turned out that foreign companies were not qualified to bid for that particular procurement because they did not satisfy the technical criteria. We have seen another development on raw materials, where, for example, there has been some discussion about the rare earth minerals or materials, which is a product that China has almost a monopoly on, where there's been introduced some export restrictions on that product, preventing the product from being exported from China to other parts of the world. The reasons given by the Chinese authorities are always quite logical. In the case of rare earth minerals, the reason was given to be environmental reasons, because the production of this material is quite polluting, and they wanted to slow down the production, we were told. On the other hand, it can also be seen as a trade issue, of course, and my colleagues in DG Trade are looking into this and that type of issues. In terms of the overall economic framework in China, it's clear that China is, by and large, moving in the right direction. If you look at issues such as IPR, it is better, much better than it was 10 years ago. If you look at the issues such as the legal framework for IPR, the framework is basically all right as we see it today. There are things that we take up every now and then, but compared to 10 years ago, it is much better. There's a complete legal framework for IPR protection now. The problem is much more on issues such as, are these being implemented correctly, these regulations? How does it look in practice? That's where sometimes we find issue, or where the European Chamber of Commerce, they find issues. But China will remain a key trading partner for us. It will also continue to grow. It's also increasingly an important investment partner, not only for us investing in China, Europeans investing in China, where we tend to invest something like $8 billion a year. It's usually the figure I use. We don't have very good data for it, but it's in that neighborhood. But we have started to see that the Chinese companies are investing in Europe too, much more than before. There's a go-out strategy followed by a number of Chinese companies. They buy into specific sectors in Europe. You saw, for example, in the discussion of Opel in Germany, that at some point there was a Chinese company involved in some of the early discussions. You saw with Saab in Sweden that a Chinese investor came forward and invested there. And we will see more and more of that moving forward. And of course, during a financial crisis, this type of investment from a company point of view is often very welcome, of course. On the political front, as I said, in 1998 we had a big change, and that was the start of the EUChina Summits. We had the first one in London in, I think it was April 1998, in the margins of the Asia-Europe meeting, ASEM, where we had a meeting in London at that time. And since then, we have had an annual summit. We have had one every year. And the summits, as you may know, are not only the European Commission, my institution, but it's chaired by the presidency, so that would say Sweden now. And our High Representative, Dr. Solana, of course, is also there, and then there's the European Commission President. We then meet with the Chinese leadership chaired by Wen Jiabao, the Prime Minister now. And we will have our next meeting. We expect it to be in Nanjing, place and date are not confirmed, but it sort of points towards Nanjing, and at the end of November, probably the 30th of November, can change, need confirmation. But the agenda for the meeting is pretty clear at this point of time. You will not be surprised. We have 3 points. One is climate change. The summit will take place just a few weeks before Copenhagen. We have to get China on board on the climate change discussion, and we hope to make a progress with them in the context of the summit. The second item will not surprise you either. That is the financial crisis. Again, China plays a key role in overcoming the crisis. We are, of course, very pleased to see the figures that I quoted before, the strong economic growth in China this year. It helps us. It helps us that our exports to China can continue to be at a relatively, or actually at a high level. And we have managed to do that. We also making an effort to make sure that the European markets are open, as you know, and the Chinese, the EU's share of Chinese exports is actually increasing in 2009, meaning that EU is becoming an even more important partner for China in terms of exports from China. The last point on the agenda is our bilateral relationship. And there we have one key item, and that is that we are trying to renew our formal agreement with China. Currently, the relationship is formally based on an agreement from 1985, an economic and cooperation agreement. And as you can imagine, in 1985, there are many issues that we did not discuss, issues that today are on the forefront of our discussions. I mentioned one of them, climate change. 1985, it was not an issue, of course. We were not aware. Same with the fight against terrorism. Again, something that in 1985 did not really appear. Today, it's important for us. So we are trying to update, we are trying to make a new agreement called the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which will contain all these different elements that have come to the fore since 1985. In the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, we have in practice 2 different negotiation tracks. We have a political track and we have a trade track. And I'm quite deeply involved on the political side. I just came back from Beijing. I was there last week. And we sort of, as a rough figure, we say that we have 30 clauses, 30 points that we have to negotiate on the political side. And at this point, we have basically agreed about 22. So we're getting quite close on the political side. We have some key clauses that we have put a bit into the background because they have to be dealt with at the last moment or at a later stage. Articles such as how do we define the relationship to Taiwan, for example, which for the Chinese side is a key point, very sensitive issue, of course. We have another issue that's quite sensitive for us, human rights. How do we define our cooperation on human rights issues? So we have some of the difficult articles we will take during the next couple of months, and we'll have to address them seriously, and that would have to be done probably also at a quite senior level in the end. I'm not pessimistic on these remaining issues. I think it will in the end be doable, fully doable, to find agreed language on both sides. And we have in fact almost closed, or in some cases closed, negotiations on articles which we could have thought would be difficult, like the fight against terrorism, the International Criminal Court, and so on. There we have made very good progress. So my hope is that at the summit there will be given a last push to the PCA, so at least on the political part, we will be able to finalize those negotiations shortly afterwards.
I have done, together with the European Council on Foreign Relations, this audit of EU-China relations, which follows on something we have done on Russia, the Europeans and Russia, and which aims to see where are the areas of strength, where are the areas of weakness in the relationship, what can be improved, and how. This is obviously a European position. I will not distinguish fully when I talk to you between Europeans, Europe, and the EU, and I will not be very specific about member states versus what can be done at the Commission level. most of us take an agnostic view, thinking that only results matter in this area. And in fact, a lot of the criticism that's gone through this report is leveled at member states, particularly the bigger member states, in fact. But let me start with an assessment. The fact is that the scale of the relationship with China has probably now overgrown the nature of the relationship. As Jessen has said, we have a huge trade figures with China, a huge deficit. Few people 5 years ago would have predicted that the EU trade deficit with China would surpass the US trade deficit, but that has happened in 2007, 2008. In 2008, you can discuss with the value of the dollar and the euro. I mean, there are small side factors, but on the whole, the trend is there. And the trend is probably continuing, given the fact that the US is going to restrain its consumption and restrain its imports for the foreseeable future. That is a fundamental fact. And of course, in the economic relationship, which matters so much to you, there is another fact which is quite important, is that we don't print the world's currency. Europe is a continent of savers, not as much as the Chinese are, but unlike Americans, which essentially means we don't have, and we probably could not get, the money flow back from China corresponding to the trade deficit that the US has got and is still getting famously to finance its own public deficit. This means the relationship between the EU and China is quite different from the relationship that the US has with China. The relationship that the US has with China is interdependent. One can deplore the fact the interdependence goes too far, or one can, on the contrary, think that it leads to a symbiosis and that it's fine. But this is not the case for EU-China relations. What is also different, of course, even though we have for decades learned about the difficulty of understanding Chinese decision-making, is that European decision-making is quite complex and, in fact, confusing. It's one of the few reassuring facts, in fact, about the relationship, that the Chinese don't always understand it very well and have shown at times that they could be completely mistaken on the direction of political trends in Europe. Such was the case in 2003, 2004, when China was quite confident that Europe would indeed lift the arms embargo that had been in place since 1989 after a European Council declaration to that effect, and was quite surprised that in the end the embargo was not lifted. China ascribed it at the time to US pressure on Europe, and of course there was that element, but there was also a very large element of inside European politicking and different positions, and China not addressing the issue as best as it might have done under other circumstances. This means that we have a strange relationship where interchange is undeniably growing. It's also growing at the human and educational level. It's growing also at the level of migration. It's growing at the level of trade, not only formally but also informally. I would, from various evidence, submit that the total quantity of imports from China to Europe is in fact much higher than what the statistics say, because there are all over Southern Europe ports like Naples or Athens, Piraeus, where a lot of great trade is happening, and it's part, of the back door to Europe, which exists for goods as well as for migrants. China is almost everywhere in our life in Europe, much more strongly than at any time previously. But the public mechanisms that have been built up in Europe don't quite live up to it. There is an added remark that one should make, is that at some point in the relationship, perhaps some people will say with the frosting of EU-US relationship at the time of the Iraqi war. One might make a political connection. Perhaps as a result of raised European ambitions, Europeans got into the game early in 2002-2003 of making the relationship strategic and therefore being much more ambitious about the goals that they could reach with China. That encompasses, of course, political goals, such as the ones that France has alluded to, and particularly the human rights and governance issue. It encompasses aid, very interestingly, whereas Japan has scaled down and finally killed its aid to China for obvious reasons. China has outgrown the aid period, whereas the US as such delivers an almost insignificant amount of aid. This is still pretty much on the European agenda, seen as an instrument of soft power, of course, seen as a way to influence China, but in fact being a very strong component of our EU-level action in China. Perhaps as much as half of EU civil servants serving in Beijing, for example, work more or less around the aid and governance programs. Meanwhile, China has been very effective over the past decade. First of all, at building up programs to better understand Europe and to better train people to deal with Europe. It's particularly striking that China has been able to set up not only language schools and as such, it was already very skilled at this, but also at European affairs. And that it has never fully made the political transition of dealing with each member state on the basis of its own merits to dealing with Europe as such. There is, of course, an official Chinese position paper to deal with Europe, which is quite recent. But that position paper should be seen more as a priority list of what China does not want to see with Europe, what it wants to avoid. And then the Chinese set out their own goals. It's not really a vision of Europe as such. What has been particularly striking for at least the last 5 or 6 years has been the large political investment that official China has made towards the E3 countries, the French, the British, and the Germans, in emphasizing with each a potentially privileged relationship, perhaps playing each of them against one another at times. Perhaps lobbying would probably be a more adequate word. But even more striking than the Chinese policy, that in some ways just makes good sense, is the fact that the big three have more or less undercut themselves by rising to that dividing game and very often not helping each other out. I was quite clear in the arms embargo debate of 2003-2004. It has been quite clear also, at least during the first half of what I would call the Tibet story in 2007-2008, sorry. It took a lot of time and probably took the cancellation, in fact, of the previous EU-China Summit, which was scheduled to be held in France, for the two other major countries of Western Europe to begin limiting their areas of divergence on those sensitive issues. That is quite striking, and I would add another fact which is coming from recent trends, which is until very recently there was really no seriously strategic points of debate or even points of contact between the EU and China. We are militarily insignificant east of Suez and probably have been since the famous British pullback of 1956. I've seen for 30 years what little assets existed in Europe dwindle down to literally zero. And even though one can argue today the Afghan story is a complete reversal of role, it's not really directly linked to East Asia in any sense. It just builds up a risk, shall we say, for Europe, but it's not directly linked to a strategic participation in East Asia. Conversely, the Chinese had a long-standing view, which they have had ever since the 1960s, that Europe was a kind of intermediate zone which you could somehow play up to your interests to some extent, but which was unlikely to take a strategic lead in any sense. The Chinese community of experts about Europe may have fooled themselves and fooled their leadership at some point in 2003 by believing that Europe as such was going to disassociate itself from the US. And I would say the fallback position since from China has been quite pessimistic, quite contrary, by saying we have no expectation at all that Europe is going to differentiate itself strategically from the US. That leads, and in our study it's quite clearly spelled out, to a degree of strategic neglect for Europe. The tough partner is the US. The deciding partner is the US, or at least was until last year's crisis, and this year's crisis. I will come back to that. It means that on the whole, the Chinese have engaged Europe recently in a fairly automatic mode. Their list of requests is pretty much always the same, and one could almost say it's ritualized. They don't necessarily perhaps take it very, very seriously, I would add, although Chinese diplomats would clearly disagree. There is the stuff about not interfering with China on domestic issues, which includes also Taiwan and Tibet. There is the stuff about lifting the arms embargo, but one might remark that if China had really wanted the arms embargo to be lifted, perhaps it would have shown one concession in one area, which it could then claim to be a major policy change that would justify the lifting of the arms embargo. It's striking over the years that he has not done that. And it constantly claims for market economy status, evidently an important issue because this is an anti-protectionist insurance, so to speak, in front of Europe, but a limited issue all the same, since WTO rules and timetables mean that the issue will lose all relevance in the next 6 years, which by now is no longer so far away. For the rest, the Chinese seem to have been content with keeping the door open, and I think they emphasize particularly the need to avoid protectionist measures in Europe, to sort of deflect the soft pressure on soft issues coming from Europe, and I include the human rights dialogue, which has been on and off, but sometimes on, yet does not lead to discernible results with Europeans. Again, it's very hard to guess what is granted, so to speak, to Europeans and what is granted to others, of course, and so we can still have the argument that Europeans are contributing to a collective persuasion of China, but taken singly, taken separately, it's very difficult to judge what kind of result they have. Big areas of optimism for Europeans have been climate change and environmental issue, which has almost replaced, in fact, the human rights agenda on top of the list with China. And perhaps there I should differentiate myself somewhat from what we wrote 6 months ago. China is perhaps moving a bit more in that area. It's moving in very contradictory ways. It is, as we speak, diminishing the overall figure for investment in alternate sources of energy. The stimulus package, the huge Chinese stimulus package, has not effectively emphasized these alternate forms of energy. But on the other side, we can sense a shift of Chinese official position, I would say 1 minute later than the potential Indian shift on the same issue, and there is probably some relevance, some echo between Chinese and Indian positions. But it now seems clear that at least for reasons of soft power, perhaps because China thinks it can figure a way to have some economic benefit out of a new policy, China perhaps will not come empty-handed to the Copenhagen summit at the end of the year. If that happened, it would be a very big change from previous years where the concrete dialogue was pretty sterile. There was aid, of course, from Europe, and the money was spent, but there was no regulatory results, no overall shifts of policy. So we are in a situation where we have to ask ourselves what to do to have more significant impact on the relationship. The paradox being, of course, that Europe being an open market with a continent-wide structure and with an extremely liberal attitude on many WTO issues, we have already expanded most of our cartridge. That is, the European market, to a considerable extent, is wide open. It's often difficult to gauge whether it's open legally, formally, or whether it's also open customarily, I would say, and in practice. You'll very easily meet in Brussels, talking to DigiTrade people who will tell you there's nothing to negotiate about with the Chinese about investment because we're open for business. We cannot deny investment. Yet you constantly meet, of course, at the national level and also on the Chinese side, people who say, well, it's not so simple. Investment is not open in practical terms in many areas. I also think that IPR, intellectual property rights, are an absolutely integral part of the exchange if our figures for trade are to grow to yet another stage. Here, one must say that the very fabric of Europe is a problem because, by definition, the EU does not have an industrial policy. It has elements of a science and technology policy with joint agencies in very advanced areas, but it does not expand beyond that. Europe has antitrust policies, famously and happily so, in place, but they are very much in advance of industrial policies and policies of support to European firms. So there is a kind of imbalance. One should stress, I've stressed that, in fact, even in front of an adverse declaration by a French economic minister, Mrs. Lagarde, some time ago, famously said, why should we have an industrial policy when Japan abandoned its industrial policy back in 1973? Well, the truth is Japan has picked up its industrial policy. Again, we don't live in the 80s or even in the 90s now. The US has a very sophisticated high-tech and export control policy that amounts to an industrial policy. All of these elements should be in place because we cannot underestimate the resurgence of China. We cannot underestimate its size. We cannot underestimate its form of economic government. I'm not going to get on the political side, but in economic government, it is evident that all European expectations that the system would dissolve, so to speak, in the market have not been met. That, on the contrary, the system is in fact stronger, more sophisticated, I would say also legally extremely skilled. Just look at the controversy that we have had over the US tire issue and the chicken and auto parts between the US and China. It's very striking that China is able not to act tit for tat by merely shutting up a sector for imports, but go to the WTO and plead the case legally, which I think it's doing constantly with Europe now over anti-dumping and systematically over anti-dumping issues when it was not doing that previously. Nothing of this reflects on a Chinese unfair or illegal behavior. On the contrary, again, the Chinese are much better now at playing the game legally and at stating their own case in many issues. It does reflect, however, on the asymmetry in status. China as a developing country, of course, which is something the leaders very much want to preserve, us as an industrialized continent, which by nature must be more open. We have to work on reducing this asymmetry as China grows. And we have to remember that we cannot collect so far the financial benefits of the relationship with China as the US does. It's a triangular game, and it's very difficult for Europeans to achieve the kind of results that the US have achieved. I will conclude very quickly by some 5 bullet points on things which were in the power audit and which we propose, which are not necessarily going to be done next month, by the way, but which are important to consider. One of them is, of course, linked to institutional reform within the EU to have better coordination of policy towards China. And I hesitate to say it, but it does put in question the nature of the European Union. It's very difficult to have a confidential 27 country-wide policy and policy documents about China, to be frank. It's equally passé for each of the big three to think that they can have their own policy, which they will push at the European level and literally force on the others. Obviously, trend has to be beyond all the controversy about the External Action Service and all this. The trend has got to be to more devolution of competence to the Commission or to a select number of interested member states in issue. We have proposed something which we call the Open Troika as a format to complement the summits which France has talked about, which exist with China. And talking about Open Troika is a way of hedging between the notion of the 27 and a pure devolution of competence to the Commission, of course, which is probably unrealistic in present political circumstance. We think, and I'm going to put that in today's words, that if the EU is clever enough, as it has just done, to be able to invent not only regulatory agencies in the financial area, but supervising agencies, as it is just doing after the de la Rosière report on the financial crisis, that it would do very well to have an agency that would be dealing with patents, that would be doing with innovation and, by implication, industrial policy. That will also, by the way, be a more efficient negotiator or bargainer with China on IPR. Firms, industrial firms today, are in part hostages of their own relationship. Now, you cannot do those things if you don't have an open political attitude to Chinese investment in Europe. Otherwise, you're just protectionist. And so our third recommendation is to have a much more strategic discussion at the European level on areas for investments, on projects. My hunch is that the US's biggest talent in dealing with China is to have thought of areas where you can go in depth and have Chinese investment that's going to be producive to the Chinese. We can't do the federal budget deficit, which the US does, fortunately for us, but we should probably have energy investment, transport investment, communication investment, and a number of areas where Just look at what the Chinese are doing. They're trying to diversify their holdings all over the world to escape from what some call the dollar trap. Well, Europe should be open for that business, but Europe should not be divided among the 27 by having exaggerated internal competition. It should have some kind of overall framework and be able to present it positively to the Chinese. These are huge changes, of course. Another, and it'll be the fifth bullet point and last, is that we have to absolutely change our traditional frame of mind, where we thought we were going to steer the Chinese through their transition, make them more like us. It's possible that the Chinese society and that Chinese policies are becoming more like ours, but if they do, it's a function of their interest, not of what we tell them. This is a sea change from the mentality that presided over first EU-level policies to China in the mid-80s, the period that France was starting to talk about. We have to think pretty much like the US did after the Russian Sputnik in 1957. We have to think of helping ourselves. We have to think of training people to deal with China, for example. We have to think of being able to aid in a fashion that's compatible with competition, I might add, our own firms in China. And that is becoming crucially important to meet the challenge. I've been a bit long, sorry, I'll stop there.